In the early 1930s, the dusty roads of Redstone County, Texas, bore silent witness to a rising storm of desperation. The Great Depression had left the region battered and hollow, with families scraping by on pennies and communities unraveling under the weight of economic collapse. Outlaws roamed more freely than lawmen could chase, and bank robberies became so frequent that some locals joked the banks should leave their vaults open just to save on repairs. Nestled near the arid edge of the New Mexico border, Redstone became an unlikely crossroads where fugitives could disappear across state lines and where justice often lagged behind. The Texas Rangers, thinly spread and battle-worn, were the last line of defense. Their job wasn't just to chase bandits, but to restore order in a land where trust had become a rare commodity. In that turbulent setting, a remote, weathered motor lodge called the Silver Rose stood quietly off Highway 287, a place that would soon become infamous, not for who it sheltered, but for what it hid beneath the sand-colored earth. Among those fighting to hold the line during Redstone County's lawless years was Deputy Marshal Silas Monroe, a man carved from the same sun-baked rock as the West Texas plains he patrolled. Silas wasn't just a lawman. He was a legend, in his time known for his steel nerves, sharp instincts, and the quiet sorrow that clung to him like dust on boots. He'd spent 2 decades tracking down outlaws, often alone, always relentless. But of all the cases that crossed his path, it was the one involving the Silver Rose Motel that never left him, not in life, and certainly not in the stories passed down after. I heard it all from my dad, who heard it from Silas himself, his own father. As a kid, I didn't understand why Grandpa Silas always seemed so distant, or why he'd drink in silence, with his eyes fixed on nothing. But as I got older, the pieces fell into place. The story wasn't just about a case gone wrong. It was about guilt, loyalty, and the darkness people can hide behind a smile. That story, the one I'm about to tell you, is more than just a family legend. It's a chilling reminder that even heroes carry scars too deep for time to heal. Silas Monroe's tale wouldn't be complete without the strange cast of characters orbiting the Silver Rose, each one stitched into the mystery like old blood in canvas. Chief among them were Jeremiah and Edna Kincaid, the elderly couple who ran the motor lodge. To outsiders, they were kind-hearted retirees, eking out their golden years on the outskirts of nowhere, charging 50 cents a night to the rare traveler who wandered in. Edna baked biscuits. Jeremiah played cards on the porch, but something about them always unsettled Silas. Maybe it was their too-perfect hospitality, or the fact that they never seemed to remember any of the criminals Silas showed them photos of, even when witnesses swore they'd been there. Then there was Ranger Travis Doyle, Silas's closest partner, and the man who volunteered for what would become the deadliest undercover operation of Silas's career. Travis had grit, charm, and the kind of swagger that made him believable as a drifter with bad intentions. Silas trusted him like a brother. The last piece of this grim puzzle came later. Red Jack Forrester, a captured bank robber with a score to settle. Bitter and betrayed, Jack revealed more than Silas could have imagined. He named the Silver Rose, said fugitives went there to vanish, and the Kincaids made sure they stayed vanished. That confession unraveled everything, pulling Silas into a nightmare, buried beneath cracked concrete and West Texas dirt. Silas's first encounter with the Silver Rose Motel came in the spring of 1932, after a liquor store robbery in Del Rio ended with a young female clerk shot dead. Witness descriptions led to a car matching the getaway vehicle being spotted near Redstone County, parked outside a lonely little lodge off Highway 287. The place had once been a stopping point for cattle drivers and salesmen, but by the time Silas and Travis Doyle arrived, it was barely a whisper of its former self. Sun-bleached, sagging, and quiet as a grave. Jeremiah and Edna Kincaid greeted them with smiles and sweet tea, the image of rural hospitality. They claimed they'd seen nothing, knew nothing, and kept no guest records, not anymore, not with business being so slow. They even let the rangers poke around the rooms, poke through the sheds, and look under the porch. But Silas noticed small things. 2 coffee cups in a room, supposedly empty. A cigarette still warm in a tray. Nothing you could write in a report, but enough to itch under the skin. The trail went cold, but not for long. A few weeks later, another robbery. And again, a witness swore the same man had checked into the Silver Rose. Still no records. Still no real answers. The Kincaids remembered someone who looked kind of like that, but shrugged off anything useful. It was the third visit that pushed Silas past suspicion. A motel guest reportedly refused to leave his room, and Jeremiah admitted to personally tending to him multiple times. Yet when pressed, he suddenly couldn't recall any details, not the man's voice, his build, or even what room he stayed in. Silas didn't need more to know something was wrong. What he needed now was proof and a way to catch them in the act. The deeper Silas and Travis dug, the more the Silver Rose Motel began to feel like a sinkhole, quiet on the surface, but ready to swallow the truth whole. By the time they made their third trip out there, the pattern had become hard to ignore. Every time a suspect vanished, the motel's name surfaced. Every time a fugitive was seen last, it was near that broken-down sign and weathered front porch. And yet, Jeremiah and Edna always had the same soft-spoken denials and the same blank stares. They never got angry, never defensive, just forgetful. As if memory itself dissolved inside those walls. But Silas wasn't ready to throw around wild accusations she didn't have the evidence. Even Travis, usually the more brash of the two, felt like they were walking a tightrope. "They're hiding something," he'd say, "but we're not going to find it poking around like tourists." So they switched tactics. They started talking to drifters, petty thieves, and the kind of folks who knew how to vanish. And slowly, a clearer picture began to form. One rumor stood out of a retirement lodge where criminals could lay low for a fee. It was said to be run by a couple so polite you'd think they were Sunday school teachers. The lodge somewhere off the 287, right between 2 dry creek beds. Silver Rose. The final push came when they caught Red Jack Forrester, a known bank bandit with a mouthful of grudges. Furious that his partner had left him to take the fall, Jack spilled everything. According to him, the Kincaids didn't just offer shelter, they offered disappearance. You paid them up front, they hid you from the law, and if you had enemies, they made sure you stayed gone for good. Travis swore and nearly broke the table when he heard it. Silas didn't say a word. He didn't have to. They had motive, they had method, and they finally had a witness. But what they didn't have was the how. How were Jeremiah and Edna hiding men so completely that even the rangers couldn't sniff them out? Until they figured that out, the Kincaids were ghosts, and the motel remained a place where men walked in but never came out. With Red Jack's confession in hand, Silas and Travis had everything they needed except for hard evidence. The law didn't operate on gut feelings or rumors, no matter how convincing. And the Kincaids were clever, always staying a step ahead, never leaving so much as a fingerprint behind. That left the Rangers with only one option: bait the trap and pray it closed clean. They brought the idea to their assistant chief in Amarillo, who after some heated back and forth, approved an undercover operation. The plan was risky: send in a third ranger, someone the Kincaids had never seen posing as a fugitive fresh off a job. He'd flash a big bag of loot talk, fast act desperate, and see if the Kincaids offered him their signature disappearance package. The ranger chosen was Clay McKinney, a younger officer with sharp instincts and a knack for playing roles. He spent days preparing, even going so far as to rough himself up and wear shoes covered in fake blood. On the day of the operation, Travis and Silas positioned themselves in a water tower about a half-mile from the motel. From there, they had a clear line of sight through binoculars just in case anything went south. Clay barreled into the motel parking lot in a stolen-looking sedan dust cloud, trailing behind him, jumped out with a duffel bag, and ran into the office like a man possessed. What happened next would have seemed absurd if they hadn't witnessed it with their own eyes. Jeremiah calmly led Clay around back to the garage, moved a broken-down truck to the side, and opened what looked like a trapdoor beneath a ratty rug. Clay was ushered down and vanished from view. It was too perfect, too smooth, like they'd done this exact thing dozens of times before. The plan was for Clay to stall long enough to learn how the Kincaids made people disappear. Once inside their secret space, he'd flash his badge, arrest them both, and signal the all clear. But minutes ticked by, then an hour. No signal. No Clay. Silas's jaw clenched. Travis kept checking his watch like it would change time. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, both rangers knew they couldn't wait any longer. The Kincaids had played this game before, but this time, they might have played it for blood. As the second hour passed, with still no sign of Clay McKinney, the tight knot in Silas's gut twisted into full-blown dread. This wasn't just a stall. Something had gone very wrong. With no radios, no backup signals, and no margin for error, the Rangers had no choice. Silas ordered the raid. Within the hour, a full task force rolled up to the Silver Rose Motel. They brought in local deputies, U.S. Marshals, even 2 federal agents out of plain view. And most importantly, they brought the dogs. The Kincaids were nowhere in sight. The front office sat eerily quiet, a coffee cup still warm on the counter. Officers spread out checking every room, every outbuilding. It wasn't until the bloodhounds began howling near the back garage that the real horror showed itself. The dogs zeroed in on an old rusted-out truck that hadn't moved in years. Beneath it, the ground seemed ordinary, until a closer look revealed a cleverly camouflaged hatch, buried under a stained rug and a layer of dirt and gravel. When they pulled it open, a stale wave of rot and formaldehyde hit them like a slap. Flashlights illuminated a narrow stairwell that led into what could only be described as a bunker, hand-poured in concrete and fitted with rudimentary plumbing and lighting. Inside were multiple chambers. The first held a small living space, bare bones with a cot, canned food, a phonograph, and a locked door at the far end. But it was behind that second door that the full weight of the Kincaids' depravity came to light. The room was cold and lined with red tile and a floor drain. A coiled garden hose sat near a metal table with dark stains. Nearby, a shelf of surgical tools glinted under weak lamplight. The walls were lined with hooks. In the far corner sat what looked like a varnishing station, complete with brushes, powders, and large mason jars of unknown liquid. And seated around a dusty poker table, dressed in clean shirts and stiff denim jeans, were the remains of 5 men. They weren't decomposed. They'd been preserved. Varnished, posed, and styled like mannequins in a twisted museum display. One held a hand of cards. Another slouched in a wooden chair grinning with waxed lips. And the 6th chair sitting awkwardly at the edge of the group was still wet. In a side room, they found Clay. He was too far gone. The official coroner's report listed trauma to the skull and massive blood loss. Silas never spoke of what Clay's face looked like when they brought him up. Travis, usually talkative, walked away mid-report and sat in the dust for nearly an hour, staring at nothing. Back above ground, Edna Kincaid was found hiding in a storm cellar. She went quietly, almost peacefully. Jeremiah was found hours later collapsed under a mesquite tree, a mile from the property, dead from an apparent heart attack. No gunfire, no standoff, just death and silence. They never stood trial, never faced a jury. But the evidence was undeniable. Photos made the front pages across the state. House of Waxed Bones, one headline read. Silas kept a copy folded tight in his Bible until the day he died. In the weeks that followed, the Silver Rose Motel was shuttered, sealed off with federal tape and posted guards. But no amount of caution could erase what had been found beneath its sun-bleached facade. The press moved on eventually, but Redstone County never forgot. For Silas Monroe, the aftermath was more than just procedural. It was personal. He buried Clay McKinney with full honors, standing graveside in full uniform, with tears he'd never admit to shedding. Travis left the force just months later, haunted by the memory of that underground room and the sixth chair, still slick with varnish. Silas, though, stayed. He had always believed in justice in the steady hand of the law. But what they uncovered at the Silver Rose twisted that belief into something brittle and uncertain. He never returned to that part of Redstone. He never again walked into a motel lobby without checking the corners and listening for footsteps behind the wall. And though the official case was closed, he spent the rest of his career with a different edge, one that came from knowing evil didn't always wear a bandana and brandish a pistol. Sometimes it wore a gingham apron and offered you sweet tea. Jeremiah and Edna Kincaid were buried in unmarked graves. The state considered it a mercy. Edna never spoke during interviews. The one time she did, she simply said, "They were already lost when they came to us." No remorse, no outrage, just a weary finality that chilled every agent who heard it. Silas retired in 1945, quiet and tired. He never told the full story to anyone, not even his own son. But he left behind a box of clippings, photos, and a small folded note addressed to Lucas Monroe. "Tell it true, boy. Don't dress it up. Some things are ugly all the way down." So, here I am, telling it true, because the ugliest part wasn't the bodies, or the bunker, or even the betrayal. It was that for years, people like Jeremiah and Edna Kincaid passed as good neighbors. That's what still keeps me up at night. I kept that note from my grandfather in a lockbox for years before I could bring myself to read it twice. Even now, his handwriting makes my stomach knot up. Not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. Silas Monroe wasn't just a ranger. He was a man who carried the burden of someone else's death, and no medal or folded flag could ease that weight. In the quiet of his final days, he sat with bourbon in one hand and the past in the other. He didn't need to say the words out loud. I saw it in his eyes. He blamed himself for Clay McKinney. And maybe that's why he passed it on to me. Not to clear his conscience, but to remind me and anyone willing to listen that evil doesn't always kick down the door. Sometimes it waits behind it smiling. So I tell this story not to scare you, but to make you see what my grandfather saw, that the darkest places in America aren't always in the shadows. Sometimes they sit right off the highway, under a hand-painted sign, with a vacancy light still blinking after all these years. Arvind Pereira was born in Colombo, Sri Lanka, but he had built a new life for himself in Mumbai, India, over the past 2 decades. At just 24, he landed a prestigious job as a floor supervisor at the iconic Taj Mahal Palace Hotel, an achievement he carried with quiet pride. He wasn't flashy or loud. Instead, he thrived on discipline, humility, and the promise of stability. What few knew, however, was that beneath his composed demeanor lay scars etched by a night of terror that reshaped his life forever. And years later that night still echoed in the silence of closed doors. Now in his early 40s, Arvind lives a quiet life with his 14-year-old daughter Maya in a modest apartment not far from the sea. She's bright, independent, and fiercely expressive, often slamming her bedroom door when upset, unaware of the storm that single sound stirs in her father's chest. To Maya, it's a teenage habit, but to Arvind, it's something far more haunting. He never told her what happened to him before she was born, not because he didn't trust her, but because the words never came easy. And so, the silence between them has remained filled with things unsaid, waiting to be understood. Their apartment sat just a few miles from where Arvind's life had changed forever, the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel, a grand landmark overlooking the Arabian Sea. To most, it was a symbol of luxury and elegance. To Arvind, it was something else entirely. He passed it often, never speaking of it, not even to Maya. She had no idea that beneath its marble facade lingered memories so vivid they still made his hands tremble, and behind her slammed doors, Those memories always came rushing back. Arvind had long searched for a way to explain it all to Maya. Why he flinched at loud noises, why her slamming the door made him go pale with fury, and why he always apologized afterward with a guilt he couldn't quite name. But the words always caught in his throat. Then, one evening, Maya mentioned a YouTube channel she loved, one that told real eerie stories sent in by viewers. That's when the idea struck him. Maybe, just maybe, someone else could help him tell the story he never could, not for shock or sympathy, but for understanding. He hoped that if Maya ever heard it told that way without him present, she might finally realize it wasn't anger she had seen in her father's eyes. It was fear, ancient, buried, and still burning behind his silence. In 2008, Arvind's career at the Taj Mahal Palace was just beginning to bloom. At 24, he had earned respect from senior staff and dreamed of long-term stability, maybe even starting a family. But everything changed on the evening of November 26th. What he first mistook for firecrackers in the lobby turned out to be automatic gunfire. Within seconds, chaos unfolded. Guests screamed, glass shattered, and the acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air. Arvind ducked behind the reception desk, heart racing, barely able to process what was happening. Armed militants had stormed the hotel, targeting civilians with military precision. From his hiding spot, Arvind watched colleagues fall, some wounded, some worse. He called emergency services in a whisper, then risked everything to guide panicked guests through hidden staff corridors. Every step was a gamble. Every breath could have been his last. The attackers weren't just shooting, they were hunting. Arvind heard them calling out in Urdu, demanding the locations of foreign guests. That moment changed him. He wasn't just a hotel supervisor anymore. He had become something else entirely, a silent survivor of one of the darkest nights in India's history. The hours that followed felt endless. Arvind, along with a small group of guests, found shelter in one of the staff-only maintenance corridors, wedged between cleaning carts and crates of dry goods. Outside their hiding place, gunshots echoed through the marble halls of the Taj, followed by explosions that rattled the floors. He recognized the distinct crack of hand grenades, one of which detonated not far from the hotel's kitchen, where some of his colleagues had been hiding. The screams that followed were short-lived, abruptly silenced in a way that made his stomach churn. The attackers were relentless, setting fires as they advanced room by room. Arvind smelled gasoline before he saw smoke. It crept along the ceiling like a living thing, thickening the air and deepening the panic. They were trying to burn the entire hotel down. From their vantage point, Arvind and the others could hear the terrorists shouting through the halls. At one point, they hijacked the hotel's PA system, broadcasting threats that sent a chill down Arvind's spine. They promised Hindus safe passage if they gave up any foreign guests hiding nearby. Arvind didn't move, but one Western woman in their group noticed his silence and with wide, tear-filled eyes begged him not to leave them. He whispered back that he wouldn't, and he meant it. Not out of heroism, but because he knew it was a lie. No one was safe. The moment he stepped into that hallway, he was as good as dead, so he stayed put, his body trembling, but his resolve firm. Through it all, Arvind kept praying the walls would hold, that help would come, and that whatever came next would be swift. In that darkness, surrounded by fear and smoke, something inside him fractured, something that would never fully mend again. When the first signs of the Indian security forces arrived, boots pounding through smoke orders, shouted in both Hindi and English, Arvind felt both immense relief and renewed fear. The siege was far from over. Gunfire intensified as elite units stormed the building. From their cramped shelter, he and the others held their breath, unsure whether the next person to open the door would be a rescuer or a killer. It wasn't until hours later, when the hotel's PA crackled again, this time with calm, clear voices urging survivors to come out slowly, with their hands raised, that Arvind dared to move. The hallway outside was a war zone. Blood streaked the walls. Shattered chandeliers glittered in the flickering emergency lights. Bullet holes pocked the marble pillars like dark, accusing eyes. He stepped carefully, guiding the others past overturned furniture and bodies some groaning, some eerily still. The once opulent Taj had become unrecognizable, a symbol of loss instead of luxury. In the following hours, Arvind gave statements, helped account for guests, and even assisted medics. But his mind had already begun to shut down. He operated on instinct, doing what needed to be done, because stopping even for a moment meant facing what he had just survived. And at that point, survival didn't feel like victory. It felt like punishment. In the weeks that followed, Arvind returned home, but something within him had irrevocably shifted. Every loud sound, a slammed car door, a dropped pan, even the distant crack of Diwali fireworks, sent his body into instant alert. Sleep became a stranger, and when it did come, it dragged nightmares with it. He was eventually diagnosed with acute post-traumatic stress disorder, though he rarely used the term himself. To Arvind, it was simpler part of him had stayed behind at the Taj, trapped in the corridors of smoke and blood. He tried therapy for a while, but the words never felt right. Instead, he withdrew quietly, steadily building a life that looked normal on the outside but trembled beneath. He never told Maya the full truth. She had been born a few years later into a world that felt safer, cleaner, and less fragile. He wanted to keep it that way. But the years passed, and as she grew more expressive, more vocal, her slammed doors and loud frustrations brought him back to the worst night of his life. He knew she wasn't trying to hurt him, but the sound, sharp and final, cut deeper than she could possibly imagine. Arvind often stood outside Maya's door after an argument, his hand hovering just inches from the frame, wanting to knock to explain, but always pulling back. How do you tell your child that a simple sound can open a door to hell? He'd tried once, fumbling through a vague explanation, but her eyes had only filled with confusion and hurt. So when she mentioned her favorite YouTube channel, one that shared real stories submitted by viewers, he saw a strange but perfect opportunity. Perhaps hearing the truth in someone else's voice would reach her in a way he couldn't. It wasn't about sympathy or closure. It was about understanding. He didn't need her pity. He needed her to see that the man who raised her wasn't angry or broken. He was human, carrying something heavier than most. Sharing his story through that channel became his way of knocking on her door one more time, not with frustration or fear, but with honesty. Not to relive the pain, but to give her a piece of it, carefully worded, gently offered in hopes that maybe finally she'd understand the silence. Arvind doesn't know if Maya will ever hear his story, or whether she'll connect the voice on the video with the quiet weight her father has carried all these years. Maybe she'll listen one evening while scrolling in bed, earbuds, unaware that what she's hearing isn't just another submission. It's the truth behind every moment. He flinched or fell silent. And maybe, just maybe, she'll recognize the story as her own too. Not in its horror, but in its honesty. Arvind isn't expecting a grand conversation or even forgiveness. He only hopes she'll understand that the anger she saw in him was never about her. It was fear, raw, buried, and triggered by something as simple as a slammed door. With that understanding might come something quieter, but stronger than words, compassion. And with compassion, perhaps the space between them will begin to close. Not all at once, but gently, like the soft click of a door closing, without force, without fear, and finally, without misunderstanding. Claire Everett never had a big family. Growing up in Pensacola, she spent most holidays alone until she met Margaret Maggie Holloway. Maggie was a longtime friend of Claire's late mother and had always treated her like a niece. Their bond formed slowly over shared meals and weekend calls, but over the years it became something deeper. Now in her late 60s, Maggie had moved out west to the drier highlands near Santa Fe, New Mexico, after developing chronic respiratory problems. Every few months, Claire made the long road trip to visit her, always looking forward to their fancy days, a shared tradition of dressing up, splurging on dinner, and pretending they weren't just two weary souls making do. This trip was no different. Claire packed up her compact sedan with snacks, gas station coffee, and a playlist of true crime podcasts. To save money for Santa Fe's boutiques and bistros, she planned to stay overnight at a budget motel near Alexandria, Louisiana, a routine stopover after 12 hours on the road. What she didn't expect was that this detour would become the most disturbing night of her life. By the time Claire reached the outskirts of Alexandria, the dashboard clock read 2:13 a.m. Her legs ached from driving, and her eyes burned despite a steady stream of caffeine. She had pulled off Highway 71 into a sleepy stretch of pine-fringed road where motels blinked their neon signs like tired eyes. One caught her attention: Bayou Pines Lodge, a modest little roadside motel, advertising rooms for just $22.95 a night. It looked clean enough, tucked beneath tall oaks, with only one flickering porch light, and given the hour, it felt like a blessing. Claire checked in through a glass partition where a man named Derek, the night clerk, slid her a key without much small talk. He looked half asleep and half annoyed to be awake. When she casually asked how many other guests were staying, he replied, "None tonight. Place is all yours." That struck her as odd. A Friday night in spring, even off the beaten path, usually meant a few travelers. Still, Claire welcomed the quiet. Maybe it was just a slow week. She rolled her suitcase across the gravel lot, up a creaking wooden stairway to room 207. The hallway was eerily silent, the kind of silence that felt thick, as if the building itself were holding its breath. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The room looked surprisingly decent for a $22 motel. Claire flicked on the light and saw a freshly made bed, beige curtains drawn tight, and a small desk with a battered but functional chair. A welcome packet sat untouched on the nightstand. She didn't bother unpacking, just grabbed her toiletry kit and headed to the bathroom, eager to wash off the day's grime. While unwrapping a new toothbrush, she instinctively reached for the waste bin beneath the sink to toss the packaging. But when she opened the lid, something gave her pause. There was no liner inside, just a bare black plastic insert. Claire crouched down to inspect it and noticed that the can had a removable insert, the kind you slide out to fit a small white trash bag. As she pulled it out, she caught sight of something scratched crudely into the bottom corner of the insert. One word: carne. She paused, brow furrowing. The word sounded vaguely familiar. Maybe Spanish? She didn't speak it, not really, but it rang a bell. At that hour, her brain wasn't firing on all cylinders, so she shrugged it off as graffiti or maybe someone's nickname. Still, the placement felt strange. Why carve something where only housekeeping would ever see it? She slid the insert back, lined it with a plastic bag from her toiletries, and tried to push the weird moment out of her mind. After brushing her teeth and taking a long, scalding shower, Claire wrapped herself in a towel and stepped into the main room, letting the bathroom's steam drift behind her. She moved with the sluggishness of exhaustion, her limbs heavy and stiff. As she rifled through her overnight bag for pajamas, she realized she hadn't yet found the hairdryer, something she always used before bed. Motel dryers were usually stashed in the deepest drawer, so she opened the small cabinet in the nightstand beside the bed. Sure enough, the dryer was there, coiled tightly with a twist tie. But something else caught her eye, a folded piece of paper tucked underneath it, barely visible. Curious, Claire reached in and pulled it out. The paper felt dry, brittle like it had been there for a while. She unfolded it slowly, half expecting to see "out of order" scrawled across it. Instead, in shaky handwriting, were 3 words: "Please get me out." That was it. No signature, no explanation. Just a desperate plea written in black ink that had bled slightly into the paper's fibers. A chill ran up her spine. She turned the note over, hoping for context. Anything to make this make sense, but the back was blank. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, tighter. Her eyes darted to the corners, the closet, the bathroom. The silence, once peaceful, now pressed in like a warning. She clutched the note and backed away from the drawer. Was it a prank? An old joke left behind by a weird guest? Or had someone really written that trapped, scared, alone in this very room? Claire's gut twisted. She'd heard too many stories that started like this and never ended well. The question now wasn't whether to take it seriously, it was what to do next. Still wrapped in her towel, Claire slipped into jeans and a hoodie, the note trembling slightly in her hand. She made her way downstairs to the lobby, heart pounding like it was trying to outrun her thoughts. Derek was still at the desk now, flipping through a faded tabloid with a bored expression. Claire approached cautiously and laid the note on the counter. "I found this in my room," she said quietly under the hairdryer. "Do you think someone could have left it as a real cry for help?" Derek glanced at the paper, then at Claire. He sighed. "Probably just some idiot messing around," he said, brushing it aside like a receipt. "We get kids pulling pranks all the time." "But what if it's not?" she pressed. "What if someone wrote this and never got help?" He leaned back in his chair and asked, "Was there any blood damage, anything broken?" Claire shook her head. "Then I don't really see a reason to call the police," he said. "You're welcome to switch rooms if it makes you feel better or check out." The indifference in his voice hit her like a slap. Claire didn't know what answer she expected, but it wasn't this. Something had happened in that room. Maybe not tonight, maybe not recently, but something wrong. And no one here seemed to care. Claire returned to her room, feeling more unsettled than before. She locked the door, bolted it, and dragged the room's only chair up against it, an instinctual move that made her feel slightly more secure, though not by much. The walls, once merely plain, now seemed to hum with a silent tension. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the folded note on the nightstand, like it might start moving on its own. Her brain flipped through every true crime story she'd ever heard, every podcast episode about a woman who didn't listen to that nagging voice in her gut. She didn't want to be a cautionary tale. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. Her suitcase still sat half-zipped on the luggage rack. And then, just like that, her decision clicked into place. She stood, grabbed her things in 3 quick motions, and headed straight for the door. No second guessing, no waiting for sunrise. She didn't even bother checking out, just dropped the room key on the lobby counter and kept walking. Back in her car parked under a flickering lamppost, she locked the doors and pulled out onto the highway. She didn't drive far. A few miles up, she found a turnout surrounded by dense pine trees and pulled over. It wasn't glamorous, but oddly, the solitude of the woods felt safer than the quiet of that motel. She reclined her seat, wrapped herself in a blanket, and tried to sleep. The last thing she saw before closing her eyes was her phone screen glowing with the words she had typed earlier, but never sent. "Found something. Not sure if it's serious, but it feels wrong." The next morning, after a few restless hours of half-sleep in her car, Claire stopped at a diner just outside Natchitoches for coffee and a hot breakfast. Her mind still churned with unease, replaying the night in fragments. Eventually, with her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, she decided to call the motel. Part of her hoped someone new would answer, someone who might take her concerns seriously. A woman picked up, introducing herself as Charlene, the day clerk. Claire calmly explained what had happened, the note she'd found, the word carne etched into the trash can liner, and exactly which room she had stayed in. Charlene paused, then said, "Ma'am, I'm looking at the room right now. That trash can is clean, still has your toothbrush wrapper inside it. But there's no writing. Nothing carved anywhere." Claire felt her stomach tighten. She repeated the location of the scratch, describing the removable liner in detail. But Charlene stood firm. "I'm sorry, but I just don't see anything like that." Whether the trash can had been swapped out or Charlene was covering something up, Claire couldn't tell. But deep down, she knew what she'd seen and that someone didn't want her to talk about it. She ended the call, thanked Charlene curtly, and got back on the road. By late afternoon, Claire finally reached Santa Fe. The sun hung low over the adobe hills as she pulled into Maggie's gravel driveway. Her hands still trembled slightly as she hugged her aunt, the weight of the night pressing on her chest. Over tea at the kitchen table, she told Maggie everything, every detail, from the etched word to the paper plea. Maggie listened quietly, then reached across the table and held her hand. "You did the right thing," she said firmly. Just 5 words, but they lifted something heavy from Claire's shoulders. Maybe it was just a prank. Maybe not. But she had listened to her instincts, and that had made all the difference. Even now, weeks later, Claire still thinks about that motel room. She sometimes wakes up from dreams where the word carne flickers behind her eyes like static. Was it a warning? A signature she may never know. What sticks with her most isn't the note itself, but how quickly someone brushed it off, how easy it was for a stranger to pretend nothing happened. Maggie's words helped her find peace, but the experience left its mark. Claire now double-checks hotel rooms. She trusts her gut without hesitation. And she's learned that evil, when it exists, doesn't always announce itself with screams or violence. Sometimes it whispers from under a nightstand or waits behind a scratched trash can. The world has dark corners, and they often hide in plain sight. But Claire knows this. Now silence can speak volumes, and your instincts might be the only voice that saves you. Nestled on a secluded island in the heart of Baekjin, the heavily fortified capital of North Korea, stands the Ryuseong Grand Hotel, a towering concrete monolith that appears more like a state-controlled observation post than a welcoming place for weary travelers. Situated along the Taedong River, the hotel rises ominously above the waterline, surrounded by barbed wire fences, silent guards, and an eerie calmness that never truly lifts. For many Americans, North Korea is a land shrouded in mystery, often dubbed the Hermit Kingdom, and the Ryuseong Grand feels like its beating heart, a symbol of tightly controlled appearances and deeper, darker intentions. Foreign visitors to the country are few, and even fewer are allowed to wander freely. Nearly all are funneled through state-approved tours and are lodged here where every floor is monitored, every hallway swept for any signs of defiance. Yet among the hotel's many secrets, none provoke more curiosity or fear than the elusive 5th floor. Officially designated as a communications and rebroadcasting level, it is off-limits to guests, guarded physically and digitally, and rarely acknowledged by staff. Whispers among past travelers speak of harsh fluorescent lighting walls, plastered with violent propaganda, and a military atmosphere that feels more like an interrogation site than a hotel corridor. To those curious enough to dig deeper, the Ryuseong Grand doesn't just represent accommodation, it represents containment. It embodies the unsettling tension between foreign curiosity and authoritarian control, a place where the facade of hospitality is just a thin veil stretched over a chilling reality. For Americans used to open skies, unlocked doors, and freedom of speech, the Ryuseong Grand Hotel is a jarring reminder that some corners of the world still operate on fear, surveillance, and silence. For most guests, the Ryuseong Grand Hotel is a strange but temporary home, a heavily surveilled resting place before the next day's itinerary unfolds. But for one American student, it marked the beginning of a journey that would spiral into a geopolitical tragedy. His name was Miles Harrington, a 21-year-old economics major from Seattle with a bright future and a passion for exploration. Unlike most tourists who chose familiar destinations, Miles was drawn to places that the average traveler would think twice about. He'd already trekked through Havana, backpacked across Eastern Europe, and volunteered in Southeast Asia. What set him apart wasn't just his intellect or curiosity, it was his unshakable belief that understanding the world meant stepping directly into its most misunderstood corners. Miles had been accepted into a semester-long study program in Hong Kong, and in the spirit of adventure, decided to add a 5-day New Year's tour of North Korea beforehand. To him, it was an irresistible opportunity to witness life inside the world's most secretive regime up close and unscripted. He signed up with East Horizon Tours, a travel group that marketed itself as your guide to the places your government warned you about. His family, understandably hesitant, ultimately trusted his judgment. After all, Miles was meticulous in planning, and well-versed in global affairs. When he arrived at the Ryuseong Grand, he was all wide eyes and polite curiosity. But deep down, something gnawed at him. He'd read about the fifth floor, had seen the scattered online accounts, cryptic blog posts, grainy elevator photos, whispered warnings. Despite the hotel's polished marble and state-curated tours, Miles sensed a staged reality. What lay beyond those guarded doors wasn't just off-limits, it was begging to be discovered. And for a curious young man like Miles, mystery was never meant to remain unanswered. While most college students spent their winter breaks soaking up sunshine or catching up on sleep, Miles Harrington was preparing for something far more ambitious. In his mind, there was no better way to bridge his studies in economics and global politics than by visiting a country where the economy was closed, and the truth even more so. He had spent weeks researching the logistics of entering North Korea, poring over articles, travel vlogs, and even Reddit threads from former visitors. That's when he stumbled upon East Horizon Tours, a niche travel company operating out of Dandong, China, just across the Yalu River. Their slogan read, "We take you where your parents beg you not to go," and that alone seemed to seal the deal for someone like Miles. After final exams at Stanford wrapped up in December 2016, he flew from San Francisco to Beijing, arriving in the frigid capital just after Christmas. There he met the rest of his group, 10 other tourists from various Western countries, including 3 other Americans. They were ushered through a lengthy customs process and presented with special travel permits issued by North Korean authorities. By the morning of December 30th, they boarded an Air Koryo flight bound for Baekjin, the North Korean capital. The aircraft was old, the flight attendants stiff and somber, but the mood among the tourists was one of excited disbelief. They were about to step foot in a country most people only read about in headlines. From the moment they landed, the entire experience was choreographed with near-military precision. The tour guides, stoic fluent in English and clearly well-trained, greeted them with fixed smiles and led them straight to the Ryuseong Grand Hotel. After check-in and a perfunctory breakfast of cold eggs and instant coffee, the group was quickly taken to Baekjin's main landmarks, the Grand People's Study Hall, Revolutionary Martyrs Cemetery, and the towering Juche Monument. The city looked sterile, yet strangely beautiful in the snow, like a stage set frozen in time. Everywhere they went, they were shadowed by guides and discreet minders, ensuring no photo was taken from the wrong angle and no tourist wandered too far. But even in the midst of this carefully scripted journey, Miles couldn't stop thinking about the hotel. More specifically, about one floor that no one ever spoke of, but everyone somehow knew the fifth. New Year's Eve in Baekjin passed like a scene from an alternate reality, an evening choreographed to showcase pride, discipline, and state-controlled festivity. After a long day of sightseeing and scripted explanations, the tour group returned to the Ryuseong Grand Hotel just in time for dinner. The dining hall was dimly lit, but elegant with polished silverware, pale linen napkins, and a peculiar blend of Western and Korean dishes. Toasts were made, glasses clinked. The wine wasn't great, but no one seemed to care. The group was, after all, ringing in the new year in one of the most secretive places on earth. That alone carried its own intoxication. After dinner, the guests were encouraged to enjoy a limited selection of drinks at the hotel's ground floor bar. The air buzzed with tipsy laughter, cautious small talk, and half-whispered questions about the government, the people, the rules. Miles, ever observant, seemed more reflective than the others, quietly absorbing every detail like a sponge. He downed a couple of beers, chatted briefly with a British tourist about North Korea's economic structure, then excused himself to use the restroom. No one saw him again for hours. Later in interviews, his fellow travelers would describe Miles as a little buzzed but clear-headed, not reckless, not erratic, just curious. And that curiosity, paired with a gut instinct that something unseen lay just beyond reach, was enough to drive him past the boundary line. At around 1:30 a.m., while the others were slowly making their way back to their rooms or watching the fireworks explode over the Taedong River, Miles stood alone in front of the elevator. His eyes were locked on a single button 5. It glowed a faint red, unlike the soft yellow light of the other floors. No one had mentioned the 5th floor. The staff had never brought it up. And yet, he had read about it online, half-confirmed tales of dimly lit corridors, hostile imagery in rooms no tourist was ever meant to see. Whether it was the alcohol, his natural defiance, or just that gnawing need to understand, Miles pressed the button. The elevator rose without sound. When the doors slid open, he stepped into a hallway bathed in cold fluorescent light. The carpet was industrial gray, the walls a canvas of steel and propaganda. He took a breath. This wasn't part of the tour. This wasn't even supposed to exist. But for Miles Harrington, the search for truth had just crossed a line that no visitor was ever meant to approach. The hallway on the 5th floor of the Ruseong Grand Hotel was nothing like the rest of the building. Gone were the polished marble walls and warm neutral color palette. In their place stood a cold metallic corridor lit by buzzing fluorescent lights that cast a sickly blue hue over everything. The walls were lined with aggressive propaganda, hand-painted murals of North Korean soldiers, bayoneting grotesque caricatures of American troops, flames engulfing the White House, and towering slogans in angry red text. The air smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and mildew, and the silence was so thick it pressed against Miles's eardrums like deep water. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the building were absorbing every sound and holding it hostage. He moved slowly, cautiously, half expecting a security guard to round the corner at any moment. But the hallway was empty, devoid of motion or noise. There were no room numbers, no visible surveillance cameras, just unmarked doors and propaganda that seemed almost alive in its hatred. One image showed an American soldier misshapen and monstrous, holding a terrified Korean child by the throat, only to be skewered by a gleaming bayonet held by a heroic North Korean fighter. Another depicted a nuclear warhead launched from the Korean peninsula, obliterating the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. In bold Korean script, the caption read, "We strike first if they invade." It was like stepping into a place designed not to impress, but to intimidate. Miles, equal parts unnerved and transfixed, kept moving until he reached a smaller hallway branching off to the right. There, tucked between 2 heavy steel doors, he spotted something unexpected: an old wooden bulletin board warped from humidity and pinned with faded notices. Most were in Korean, but one caught his attention. It was a smaller torn poster hanging loosely from a bent tack. The illustration showed a group of factory workers smiling beneath the watchful eye of a soldier, with text beneath that roughly translated to loyalty: build strength. Obedience ensures peace. Without thinking, Miles reached out and gently pulled the paper from the board. It wasn't large, roughly 12 by 18 inches, and it felt brittle like aged parchment. He didn't intend to steal it, at least not in the traditional sense. Maybe he wanted to study it more closely, or maybe he thought it would make a compelling conversation piece back home. Whatever the reason, the act was small. But in North Korea, even the smallest transgression can be fatal. Miles tucked the poster under his jacket and quietly made his way back toward the elevator, his heart thudding harder with each step. The return ride was uneventful. The hallway to his room was silent, and when he shut his door behind him, locking it carefully, it felt as though nothing had happened. But in a country ruled by paranoia and control, nothing ever goes unnoticed for long. 2 days later, just before sunrise, the tour group gathered in the lobby of the Ruseong Grand Hotel, groggy and quiet, as they waited for their ride to the airport. The New Year's celebrations were over, and the mood had shifted from awe to a quiet eagerness to leave. Miles Harrington stood near the back of the group, bundled in his coat, holding a cup of weak hotel coffee. He looked tired but calm. No one noticed anything unusual. At Baekjin International Airport, the group was escorted through a separate checkpoint, bypassing local travelers. As they lined up at passport control, two uniformed officers approached Miles. They didn't say a word, just tapped him on the shoulder and gestured for him to follow. A few travelers assumed it was a routine bag check. Others barely noticed. But when the final boarding call echoed through the terminal and Miles still hadn't returned, murmurs of worry began to ripple through the group. When the plane doors closed and only a North Korean officer stepped aboard, not Miles, his roommate, a Brit named Tom Reynolds, knew something was wrong. He just vanished, Tom would later say in an interview. No struggle, no shouting. Just gone. As the plane lifted off, leaving Baekjin behind, confusion and unease settled over the group. One official from East Horizon Tours mumbled something about a medical issue, then quickly fell silent. It would be the last time anyone from the group saw Miles in person. For the rest of the passengers, the surreal, tightly choreographed trip had ended. But for Miles Harrington, it was just beginning, and behind closed doors, in a place no camera would ever reach, the consequences of a single sheet of paper were already unraveling with terrifying speed. The official explanation didn't come for weeks, and when it did, it was delivered in the most chilling way possible on national North Korean television. Miles Harrington, once a bright-eyed student from Seattle, was now a somber figure in a pressed gray suit, seated stiffly at a podium flanked by North Korean flags. He read from a prepared statement in a slow, mechanical tone, his voice stripped of emotion. He admitted to stealing a propaganda poster from a restricted area of the hotel, claiming he had done so at the request of a religious organization in the United States and a secret society at his university. He bowed repeatedly, pleaded for forgiveness, and accepted full responsibility for his crime against the state. But for those watching back home, none of it sounded like Miles. His friends and family immediately questioned the authenticity of the confession. The words didn't match his character or convictions. Analysts noted that the speech echoed standard phrasing used by other foreign detainees in North Korea, suggesting it had been scripted and likely coerced. Even more disturbing was the revisionist detail. Instead of mentioning the fifth floor where the act actually took place, the confession claimed the poster had been taken from the second floor, a likely attempt to discredit rumors of a secret level entirely. To those who knew him, it was clear Miles wasn't speaking freely. He was performing under immense pressure for an audience he could neither see nor appeal to. It was a show trial in everything but name, and the message behind it was unmistakable curiosity. In the wrong place was not just dangerous, it was criminal. For Miles, the consequences were no longer theoretical. He was now a prisoner in one of the most closed-off nations on Earth, and his fate had become a matter of global attention. Just 2 weeks after the televised confession, North Korea's Supreme Court convened a closed-door trial that lasted less than an hour. With no legal counsel, no defense witnesses, and no opportunity for appeal, Miles Harrington was found guilty of acts hostile to the state under Article 60 of North Korea's Criminal Code. The evidence presented was limited, grainy surveillance footage of a man allegedly entering a restricted hallway, a low-resolution clip showing someone removing a poster from a wall, and Miles's coerced confession. But in a system built on spectacle rather than justice, that was more than enough. The sentence, 15 years of hard labor in one of the country's notorious prison camps. American officials were quick to condemn the ruling. Human rights organizations labeled the trial a kangaroo court, while Miles's family was left in a state of grief and disbelief. They knew he'd made a mistake, perhaps one driven by curiosity and naivete, but nothing could justify the severity of the punishment. For a sheet of paper, he was now being subjected to a sentence designed to break people in both body and spirit. Back in the U.S., calls to bring Miles home grew louder. Demonstrators gathered in front of the North Korean embassy in New York, holding signs that read, "Justice for Miles," and "Curiosity isn't a crime." Diplomats scrambled behind the scenes, but North Korea remained unmoved. For them, Miles wasn't just a student. He was a bargaining chip, a tool in a long game of propaganda and political theater. And as the weeks turned into months and the silence grew heavier, it became painfully clear that Miles wasn't just in North Korea, he was lost in it. Trapped inside a regime that saw no value in mercy, only in message. For over a year, there was no word from Miles Harrington. The North Korean government offered no updates on his condition, no photos, no letters home. Only silence. Then in June 2018, seemingly without warning, they announced that Miles would be released on humanitarian grounds. The news sparked immediate celebration in the United States, but that relief turned to horror the moment the details emerged. Miles had been in a coma. According to North Korean officials, he had contracted a severe case of foodborne botulism shortly after sentencing and had slipped into unconsciousness after taking a sleeping pill. He had remained in that vegetative state for nearly 14 months, entirely unknown to the outside world. When Miles arrived at the University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle, doctors were shocked by what they found. Though he could breathe on his own and his heart remained strong, he showed no signs of awareness. Scans revealed extensive brain damage consistent with prolonged oxygen deprivation. There were no obvious signs of physical trauma. No bruises, no broken bones, no clear indications of torture. But something catastrophic had happened. Some doctors speculated that a cardiopulmonary event had left his brain starved of oxygen, while others questioned whether unorthodox interrogation techniques had been used, such as near drowning or asphyxiation. Despite their best efforts, the medical team couldn't reverse the damage. The boy who once debated international trade policy over coffee was now locked in a body that didn't respond to the world around him. His parents, devastated, yet resolute, made the impossible decision to let their son go. On June 19, 2018, Miles Harrington passed away at the age of 22. The nation mourned. Vigils were held at his former high school. Ribbons were tied to every lamppost on the 3-mile route from the church to the cemetery. Politicians on both sides of the aisle condemned North Korea's actions, calling them inhumane and unjustifiable. The White House issued a statement, blaming the regime for a tragic and preventable loss of life, while human rights advocates called for renewed attention on the thousands of unnamed prisoners still held in North Korean labor camps. Miles's story, once confined to a restricted hotel floor and a single torn poster, now stood as a chilling reminder of how easily freedom could be lost and how in some corners of the world, a moment of curiosity could cost a life. Miles Harrington didn't set out to become a symbol. He was just a curious young man chasing understanding in a world that often punishes those who ask too many questions. But through his quiet courage and the tragic price he paid, he exposed a sliver of truth hidden behind the iron curtain of secrecy. His story is no longer just about a poster, a forbidden floor, or a lost student. It's about the power of remembrance, the fragility of freedom, and the duty we all share to speak for those who cannot. As time moves forward and headlines fade, what remains is a name that now stands for more than a single life. It stands for justice awareness and the unyielding hope that someday, even in the darkest corners of the world, light will break through. Enjoyed the content and want to dive deeper into real, mysterious, and unsettling stories from around the world? Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any upcoming videos. Every bit of support from you helps us continue uncovering shocking events, hidden truths, and powerful lessons from real-life experiences. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey.